The video presents Venezuela's current crisis not as a routine political collapse, but as the unfolding of a prophetic warning spoken decades earlier by Jeane Dixon. Rather than focusing on elections, ideology, or international power struggles, the narrative reframes events through a spiritual lens, suggesting that what is happening in Venezuela transcends ordinary geopolitics. According to this perspective, the sudden fall of a powerful leader in the South was never meant to be understood merely as the removal of a ruler, but as a symbolic rupture meant to awaken an entire continent. Jeane Dixon's vision, as described in the video, emphasizes that the true shock would not come from the act of collapse itself, but from its spiritual consequences. The fall of this leader is portrayed as a moment that strips away illusions, revealing how deeply a nation can intertwine its identity, hope, and moral direction with a single figure. When that figure is removed, what remains is not immediate freedom or clarity, but a profound silence filled with uncertainty, fear, and questions of meaning. This silence, the video argues, is the real tremor that travels beyond borders. By framing the crisis as prophetic, the video suggests that Venezuela's suffering serves as a mirror for the wider region. The leader's downfall is not depicted as an isolated national event, but as a warning to other nations in the South that political stability without spiritual grounding is fragile. The collapse becomes a signal, exposing how societies can slowly drift from truth, faith, and moral responsibility while appearing outwardly strong. Ultimately, the video argues that the spiritual shaking Dixon foresaw is still unfolding. Venezuela's crisis challenges neighboring nations and individuals to examine where they place their trust. Is it in systems, personalities, and promises of comfort, or in deeper, enduring values? In this telling, the prophecy is not about predicting destruction, but about urging awakening before similar collapses repeat elsewhere. Jeane Dixon is presented in the video as one of the most controversial prophetic figures of the 20th century, not because she sought attention or power, but because her warnings repeatedly seem to intersect with real historical events. Born in 1904, Dixon rose to prominence after several of her predictions appeared to materialize with unsettling precision. Most famously, she is often credited with foreseeing the assassination of President John F. Kennedy years before it occurred, a moment that permanently etched her name into public consciousness and divided opinion about her legitimacy. What distinguishes Dixon in this portrayal is not simply the accuracy of certain predictions, but the nature of her focus. Unlike political analysts or fortune-tellers who concentrate on dates, names, and outcomes, Dixon's warnings were framed around consequences, especially moral and spiritual ones. She was less concerned with who would fall or rise, and more with what such events revealed about the inner condition of nations and societies. To her, political upheaval was never random. It was the outward expression of deeper spiritual erosion. The video emphasizes that Dixon believed history responds to moral choices. Wars, assassinations, and national collapses were not just power shifts, but signals that something fundamental had been neglected. She warned that when societies abandon truth, humility, and spiritual grounding in favor of comfort, pride, or blind loyalty, collapse becomes inevitable, though not always immediate. In this sense, her prophecies functioned less as predictions and more as diagnoses. This is why Dixon remains controversial. Critics dismiss her as coincidental or symbolic, while supporters argue that her insights continue to resonate because they address timeless human patterns rather than isolated events. The video suggests that Dixon's enduring relevance lies in this deeper perspective. Her warnings were not meant to inspire fear, but reflection, urging people to look beyond headlines and ask what moral and spiritual conditions give rise to history's most dramatic moments. Dixon's warning about Venezuela, as presented in the video, stands apart from traditional predictions of national collapse because it places responsibility not on foreign enemies, military invasions, or external conspiracies, but on internal spiritual decay. She did not describe tanks crossing borders or bombs falling from the sky. Instead, she warned of a slow, almost invisible erosion within the nation itself, a gradual departure from truth, faith, and moral clarity in exchange for comfort, security, and reassuring promises. According to this vision, Venezuela's tragedy would unfold quietly at first. Prosperity and abundance would create a false sense of invulnerability, masking deeper compromises taking place beneath the surface. Dixon suggested that when a nation begins to value comfort over conviction, it opens the door to deception. What appears as progress slowly becomes dependence, and what is accepted as protection turns into control. This internal shift, not an external attack, would set the stage for collapse. As spiritual foundations weakened, practical consequences would follow. Scarcity would replace abundance, not merely as an economic failure, but as a symptom of deeper disorder. Fear would spread, silencing dissent and reshaping loyalty into survival. Over time, hope itself would erode, leaving people emotionally numb and resigned to hardship. Dixon foresaw that this condition would drive millions into exile, not only a physical departure from their homeland, but a spiritual displacement marked by grief, loss, and broken identity. The warning carries a sobering implication. Venezuela's suffering was not inevitable, nor imposed from outside. It was the result of choices made gradually, often unnoticed, as truth was softened and faith reduced to habit. In this framing, the crisis becomes a cautionary mirror, reminding other nations that collapse often begins long before shortages appear, starting in the quiet moment when comfort is chosen over conscience. The fall of leadership, in Dixon's warning, is not portrayed as the climax of a nation's crisis, but as the opening of a far more dangerous chapter. According to this perspective, removing a powerful ruler does not automatically restore clarity, justice, or hope. Instead, Dixon warned that the most vulnerable moment comes after the collapse, when the structures that once defined daily life suddenly disappear, leaving behind silence, confusion, and a deep loss of identity. This silence is not peace, it is the absence of direction. For years, people may have organized their fears, loyalties, and even their sense of self around a single leader or system. When that center vanishes, the noise of propaganda and control is replaced by an unsettling stillness. Dixon believed this moment would feel heavier than oppression itself, because freedom without understanding can feel like abandonment. People no longer know what to believe, who to trust, or what their future should look like. Confusion quickly follows. Competing voices rush in, each offering answers, promises, or explanations. Without a clear moral or spiritual foundation, a nation becomes vulnerable to new illusions that simply replace the old ones. Dixon warned that in this stage, truth often becomes negotiable, and fear masquerades as caution. The danger is not chaos alone, but paralysis, a population afraid to move forward, yet unable to return to the past. Most critically, Dixon emphasized the loss of identity. When a nation has tied its purpose to a leader rather than enduring values, the leader's fall leaves a void in meaning. Who are we now? What do we stand for? In Dixon's view, how a nation answers these questions after collapse determines whether renewal begins or whether the cycle of deception quietly starts again. She described a charismatic leader who did not rise through fear alone, but through hope. In Dixon's warning, this figure emerged at a moment of national frustration, speaking the language of dignity, justice, and protection. He presented himself as a defender of the people, someone who understood their pain and promised to restore pride and stability. At first, his words felt like rescue. The nation responded with applause, trust, and deep emotional attachment. What made this leader dangerous, Dixon suggested, was not overt cruelty in the beginning, but the way he cultivated loyalty. Rather than ruling primarily through force, he ruled through emotional dependence. People were encouraged to see their identity, security, and future as inseparable from him. Support for the leader gradually became a moral test. To question him was to betray the nation. To doubt him was to side with its enemies. In this way, loyalty replaced discernment. Over time, the promised protection began to tighten into control. Political institutions weakened as personal authority expanded. Yet, Dixon emphasized that the deeper damage was spiritual. As emotional loyalty intensified, independent thought faded. Truth became secondary to narrative, and faith was redirected away from enduring values toward the image of the leader himself. The nation's moral compass slowly recalibrated around power rather than principle. This process, Dixon warned, suffocated the nation long before it collapsed. People still spoke of freedom, but lived within invisible boundaries. They still used the language of faith, but their trust had shifted to a human figure. By the time hardship became undeniable, the spiritual damage was already done. In Dixon's vision, this kind of leadership does not merely govern bodies, it reshapes beliefs, leaving a nation weakened even before the political structure begins to fall. Dixon predicted that the removal of the leader would come suddenly and by force, not through gradual reform, elections, or peaceful transition. In her vision, the fall would shock the nation precisely because there would be no time to prepare emotionally. One moment, the figure who had dominated public life for years would be present. The next, he would be gone. Yet Dixon emphasized that this dramatic moment would not ignite widespread celebration or relief among the people. Instead, she warned of paralysis. The immediate aftermath would be marked by a strange stillness, a spiritual pause rather than a political victory. People would feel suspended between fear and hope, unsure how to react or what to believe. Years of survival under control had conditioned them to expect disappointment, making even good news feel dangerous. Dixon believed that prolonged oppression dulls emotional response, leaving people numb when freedom finally appears. This pause, she suggested, would be one of the most revealing moments in a nation's history. Without the familiar structure of power, people would confront unanswered questions about identity and purpose. Who are we without this leader? What do we stand for now? Dixon understood that when hope has been deferred for too long, it becomes fragile. People fear hoping again because hope, once broken repeatedly, feels like a risk they can no longer afford. The danger of this spiritual pause lies in vulnerability. Dixon warned that uncertainty creates openings for new illusions, rushed solutions, or false saviors. If clarity and truth do not emerge, paralysis can harden into apathy. In her view, this moment of stillness is not empty. It is a crossroads where a nation either begins genuine renewal or quietly drifts into another cycle of dependence and disappointment. The post-collapse period is framed as the most dangerous phase of all, not because power has fallen, but because a vacuum has formed. Dixon warned that when a dominant leader or system disappears, the empty space left behind does not remain neutral. Something always moves in to replace it. If truth, humility, and faith do not rise to fill that space, deception and fear will inevitably take their place, often disguised as stability, unity, or rescue. In this vacuum, appearances can be deeply misleading. Outward calm may be mistaken for peace, and foreign assistance may feel like salvation. Dixon cautioned that relief should not be confused with restoration. External support can change structures, provide resources, and stabilize systems, but it cannot heal the inner fractures of a nation. Without a moral and spiritual foundation, even well-intentioned help can become another dependency rather than a path to renewal. Fear thrives in moments like this. After long periods of suffering, people crave certainty more than truth. They may accept comforting narratives, simplified answers, or new authorities simply to escape uncertainty. Dixon believed this is how deception gains power, not through force, but through exhaustion. When people are tired, confused, and emotionally drained, they are more willing to trade discernment for reassurance. Humility, in Dixon's view, is the antidote to this danger. A nation must be willing to confront its own failures rather than assigning blame outward. Faith, too, must move beyond ritual into conviction. Without these qualities, the vacuum becomes fertile ground for another illusion, one that promises peace but deepens fear beneath the surface. Dixon's warning is clear. What follows collapse determines whether a nation heals or merely replaces one form of bondage with another. The January 3, 2026 capture of Venezuela's president is presented in the video as the moment when Jeane Dixon's vision moved from distant warning into living reality. What makes this event feel prophetic in the narrative is not only the sudden and forceful removal of a long-standing leader, but the emotional aftermath that followed. Dixon had emphasized that the true significance of such a fall would not lie in the explosions, arrests, or military action, but in the silence that comes after power is stripped away. According to this interpretation, violence is loud and visible, easily analyzed by media and politics. Silence, however, is harder to explain and far more revealing. After the president's capture, the expected images of mass celebration or national jubilation failed to materialize. Instead, the country seemed to hold its breath. Streets grew quiet, emotions were restrained, and reactions were muted. Dixon foresaw this response as a sign of deep psychological and spiritual exhaustion. Years of survival had drained the people of easy hope. The video frames this silence as a collective reckoning. Without the familiar figure of authority dominating public life, Venezuelans were suddenly left alone with unresolved questions. The absence of noise exposed wounds that had been buried under routine, propaganda, and fear. In this stillness, people were forced to confront uncertainty about identity, belief, and direction. Who are we now that the symbol of power is gone? What do we trust when the voice that once defined reality has disappeared? In Dixon's vision, this silence is not empty. It is crowded with meaning. It marks a threshold between collapse and renewal. The danger, she warned, is not the violence of the fall, but what fills the quiet afterward. If truth and humility do not emerge, fear and deception will. Thus, the January 3rd event is portrayed not as an ending, but as the opening of a far more decisive chapter in Venezuela's spiritual and national journey. Foreign intervention is described not as a solution to Venezuela's crisis, but as a mirror held up to the nation's inner condition. In Dixon's warning, outside forces may remove leaders, stabilize institutions, or enforce temporary order, but they cannot repair what has been broken at a spiritual level. Intervention can expose weakness, confusion, and dependency, yet it lacks the power to heal the deeper wounds that caused the collapse in the first place. The video emphasizes that this mirror effect is often misunderstood. When external help arrives, relief can feel like restoration. Structures change, shortages ease, and the immediate pressure lessens. However, Dixon cautioned that such changes address symptoms rather than roots. If a nation's moral and spiritual foundations remain fractured, the same patterns will eventually reappear under new names and new authorities. Foreign involvement, in this sense, reveals how much a people have relied on outside power rather than internal renewal. Dixon believed that true restoration must come from within, through honest self-examination, humility, and a return to core values. No foreign army, alliance, or institution can restore identity, purpose, or faith. These are choices that must be made collectively and personally. Without them, intervention risks becoming another illusion of rescue, replacing one dependency with another. The mirror is uncomfortable because it reflects responsibility. It forces a nation to confront not only what was done to it, but what it allowed, tolerated, or ignored. In Dixon's view, this exposure is not meant to shame, but to awaken. Only when people recognize their own role in decline can genuine healing begin. External forces may open the door to change, but only internal transformation can determine what walks through it. The prophecy culminates not in despair, but in a tension between warning and hope. In Dixon's vision, Venezuela's crisis is not an isolated tragedy confined to one nation's borders. It is a signal meant to be seen by others. The collapse serves as a revelation, exposing truths that are often hidden during times of stability and prosperity. When systems fail and leaders fall, what a nation truly believes in, what it has trusted, ignored, or compromised, comes into full view. Dixon emphasized that collapse is not random punishment, it is exposure. It reveals whether a society has built its identity on enduring spiritual foundations or on fragile structures such as power, wealth, ideology, and personality. In this sense, Venezuela becomes a mirror for other nations, especially those that appear stable on the surface but may be quietly drifting from truth and moral clarity. The prophecy warns that no nation is immune simply because it is comfortable or confident. Yet alongside this warning, Dixon offered hope. She believed that renewal is always possible, even after severe collapse. But the path to renewal does not run through new systems, foreign alliances, or charismatic leaders. These may bring temporary order, but they cannot restore meaning. True restoration, she argued, begins inwardly, with humility that admits failure, repentance that confronts compromise, and spiritual awakening that revives conscience and faith. This kind of awakening is rarely dramatic. Dixon described it as quiet and personal, beginning in homes, small communities, and individual hearts rather than in government halls or public spectacles. It requires people to remember who they are beyond politics and who they are accountable to beyond human authority. Only then can rebuilt institutions stand on something solid. The prophecy ultimately challenges nations and individuals alike. When collapse comes, will people rush to replace one system with another, or will they pause long enough to ask deeper questions about purpose and truth? Dixon believed that history offers moments of mercy, windows in which direction can still be changed. Venezuela's crisis in this light is not just a warning of what can be lost, but an invitation to rediscover what truly sustains a people.